and that was the beginning of the rivalry. So that night, we go to an after party and Mr. Combs approached me, Mr. Knight, at the club. It was called The Tunnel in New York. He says, "Were you there?" He says, "I was there, standing right there." And they approached him. He's like, "Hey, what's going on? Why are you dissing me in front of everybody like that?" Then it got heated, words or exchange of words, and they walked away. Everybody went, on their own separate ways. So this is August. The reason I know the date, at some point, there was a confrontation between Death Row Records and Bad Boy Records, or backstage of a show. He says, "Yes, sir." So what happened was, like I said, they elected to have Biggie Smalls or Mr. Wallace perform. And while they were leaving, they were planning on leaving probably because they knew that Death Row was coming. I don't know, but they were planning on leaving. As we're going into the auditorium or exiting our vehicles, we go into the auditorium, they're coming out. So I guess it was just a bad timing, and there was an argument that followed by a little of gunplay or a pointing. So who was the argument between? He says Mr. Shakur was the most vocal, Mr. Wallace, and then his entourage. And I did notice one particular individual. And what particular individual did you notice? Mr. Davis, Mr. Keefe Davis, or Dwayne Davis? Mr. Davis go by a nickname that you're aware of? He says, "Yes, sir." And he says, "What's that nickname?" "Keefe D." "And you did what you do as a result of being security, right?" He says, "Yes, sir." He says, "What did you do as a result of seeing this?" He says, "I jumped out of my car and I pretty much was on top of it." In my words, I pointed my gun towards the gentleman. All right, I didn't go because of issues at the club, of course. And us being unorganized, we're even to the fact that Mr. Shakur called me looking for Mr. Knight, as everyone always did. And he pretty much informed me that he's tired of going to the fight late, because Mike Tyson's fights usually be over then in the first round. And even with Mr. Shakur, his music, he had rapped a song for him to enter the ring in, and he wanted to be there. And he and his security caught a cab over to the fight. Mr. Shakur took a cab to the MGM Grand for the fight. Yes, sir, from the Luxor. Welcome back to another video with IDN TV. Now we're still covering the grand jury testimony for Keefe D. Now in this particular video, we highlight everything about Suge Knight, everything about Tupac and Tupac's security. I learned a lot of stuff about what happened that night on Vegas. Even he had to take a taxi cab to the fight because Suge Knight was taking too long. So make sure you watch this video all the way through. Make sure you like the video. It's a good read. So if you guys appreciate, me taking my time and doing all this, please make sure you comment below and like the video. Let's get right into it. All right, good morning, sir. How are you doing today, sir? Good. Where did you grow up? I grew up initially in Los Angeles, the Watts area of Los Angeles. About the second grade, I guess that would make me around 7 or 8, my family moved to the city of Compton. And they asked, "In the city of Compton, what did your father do?" He says, "My father was a police officer. My childhood and the rank of captain in the city of Compton Police Department." "And what's your father's name?" "Reginald Lilborn Sr." And they asked, "Did he work for a particular unit during that time as a youth in Compton?" He answered this. He says, "Well, initially, like most patrol officer, and he eventually for a long time of his career was over gang and an officer in the gang unit. Then later he supervised the gang and homicide unit for the city of Compton." They asked, "All right, now when you were growing up, did you live next to or interact with any known gang members or people who became gang members?" He says, "Yes, sir. To be honest, my main area that I grew up in was the Mob Harus or the Lauders Park area. However, the city of Compton is one of the most unique cities. It's only 8 miles wide, pretty much kind of know or have associated with a lot of the gangs and guys from other neighborhoods because of the park and recreation, which I was real active in growing up. Little League Baseball, Pop Warner football, and basketball." "Did you know somebody by the name of Marion Knight when you were growing up?" He says, Yes, sir, I did." "And was there another name that Mr. Knight went by?" "Yes, sir, Suge Knight." "And how did you know Mr. Knight?" "We had initially met. He's a year older than me in grade and in school grades. So if I was in second grade, he was a third grader. Just guys that grew up in the same area, in that same neighborhood, that was going to the same elementary school." They asked, "Did you ultimately play ball with Mr. Knight?" "Yes, sir. So Suge Knight and I, and I'm sure as a few other kids from my neighborhood, went to another school district outside of Compton Unified School District, which was Linwood Unified School District. And that's where we played high school football from the 11th to 12th grade. I had went to a Catholic school my 9th and 10th grade year, a school in Los Angeles called the Bourbon Day High School. I thought I was going to be a basketball player, but I was wider instead of taller. They said, all right, I'm going to move fast forward a little bit. At some point, did you join the Compton Police Department? He says, yes, sir. And tell us about that. He says, so I started attending Cal State University of Long Beach State College. This was in 1984. But I got hired on as a jailer while I was going to school, a civilian employee job as a civilian jailer for the City of Compton Police Department. Once I finished school, then I was allowed to, I applied to become a police officer when I was at the age of 22. And in 1989, I went through the police academy, but I wasn't hired officially as a police officer until 1990. They asked this, they said, what kind of work did you do when you were a police officer with Compton? Mr. Wright replied, he says, I was a police patrol officer that worked the streets. During that time, it was only a few officers in the gang unit. It was also my father. He was a sergeant at the time, and he had 2 officers that worked under him during that time. Tim Brandon, who's no longer with us, he passed away about a year or 2 ago, and I call him Bobby, but his name is Robert Ladd, that worked under his unit. And they were pretty much gang officers for the city. They asked, at some point while you're working in patrol, did you start moonlighting or working security in order to increase your money coming in? Mr. Wright says, yes. After I made probation, to be honest, in 1990 when I started, I was one of those officers that worked a lot of overtime and did a lot of moonlighting because I was still young. And so I did a lot of work and eventually started to work for Death Row Records. And to understand a little bit about the moonlighting generally before we get into Death Row, was it common for patrol officers or was it allowed for patrol officers to moonlight as security while they were off duty? Yes, we had a procedure a lot of us followed, but they didn't enforce it too much. But if you got caught doing something, then it got enforced. But we had to put in what we called a work permit, which meant that we had to get the permission from the police chief or maybe a commander. I forgot at the time, to be honest, to be approved to work that particular job. But they allowed us to work pretty much anything we put in for. They asked this, they said, before we get to the death row moonlighting, was there any other kind of moonlighting you got into? Mr. Wright replied, he said, okay, I worked nightclubs, comedy clubs. We had a hotel in the city of Compton. It was called Ramada Inn. It's a casino now. And so I worked there 1 or 2 nights a week, working in the comedy club or in the hotel in general. Trucking companies, I worked at a few production sets as well. And what were you supposed to do while you're moonlighting? He said, mainly I was there on the production sets. It was because movies, they would like to film in Compton and do a lot of things to get actual sets on video shoots and stuff like that. So it was mostly to protect the equipment because, you know, you have all of this expensive equipment out here and they wanted to watch that. They also maybe wanted to keep the gang members away because they like to pressure the production companies into putting them in the scene. They had a sense of entitlement. While they're in our neighborhood, one of us is going to be representing, you know, in this set or this shoot. Now, you were familiar with the gang area members at the time, and were they familiar with you? Our police department was about 130 to 160 squad. My father, Reginald Wright Sr., was actually real popular in the city, and I was like little Reggie. And I kind of wanted to be like him, like my father, into the gang initially. Later. Not initially, I was a little different, but eventually, yes. That kind of grew when I was kind of known well a lot into the gangs and the gang members in the city. Now, you mentioned Death Row. Before we talk about what you did at Death Row, can you tell us what Death Row actually was? He replies, he says, Death Row Records was a record label that had some, maybe 1 or 2 R&B singers on it, but mainly was gangster rap music. And to your knowledge, who ran Death Row Records? Suge. Well, Marion Hugh Knight is his name, but we call him, or I refer to him really as Suge Knight. He was the CEO of the company. And he says, what do you call him when you get interacted with him? He says Suge. They ask Suge? Yeah, Suge. So we'll just call him Suge. Okay. So how did you ever come to the point where the idea of moonlighting for Suge came up? It eventually happened in 1994. And how did this come about? Well, my father, Reginald Wright Sr., had some intel on one of the guys or some of the guys that were working for him because he was instrumental, not having been a smart move to find out later, but at the time he was hiring guys that were getting out of prison and giving them jobs. And by saying that, you mean Suge was hiring people out of prison and giving them jobs? Yes, sir. People that he grew up with and from the city of Compton and other cities, yeah. I could say other places as well, Long Beach and the Los Angeles area. But he was real instrumental in doing that. That was a real big thing that he wanted to do or was proud of, to be honest. So my father got intel that a few of the guys that was working for him were planning on coming up after extorting him or robbing him for money. He knew and he had a relationship and told me, he says, hey, I need you to reach out and get a hold of Suge. Now to this day, I do not remember how I did, but I know I eventually got to him and we met, all three of us. They asked, so when you say all three of us, who are you talking about? He says, myself, Reginald Sr., and Mr. Knight, or Suge Knight. Now, what happened at this meeting? He says pretty much him saying, man, some of them guys that are working for you are planning on maybe, robbing you and taking advantage of you for some money, that he had got this information. Suge Knight laughed it off. He says, oh man, they all happy, they won't do nothing to me. I ain't worried about that. But that's why I need you over here working for me, looking out. Myself, I had recently just got into a car accident. This is not why I'm like this currently. And I had messed up my right ankle. So, and plus I was 27, 26 years of age. It was in the mid 90s. The atmosphere and I wasn't married. I wanted to be around for it, for lack of a better word. Fairly to say it's very, at this time, gangster rap was taking off, particularly in Compton, fair to say. Mr. Wright replies, he says, yes, sir. And what that brought was a lot of money, girls, and all of the things associated with fame. Correct. And so they asked this, you sit on the 50-yard line of the Super Bowl. Stuff I haven't done, just from being a cop that I was exposed to. So it's fair to say that you were attracted to the lifestyle that your acquaintance Suge Knight had developed? He says, yes, sir. So what did your father think? Father decide to work for Death Row Records? He right there told him he can't do that the position I'm in. Now, to be honest, one of the guys that's working for you, I'm trying to investigate, investigate them on open cases right now. I'm trying to put them in jail. I wouldn't do that. And they asked, so your father was a hard no when it came to? He says, yes, it was a hard no. It was like, however, even when he told him that I wasn't ready for it, to be honest, and he recommended a lieutenant that had an ownership in a security company that he knew, that Suge knew his, some family ties to that, and he said that you might want to talk to him, which he did. His name was Danny Sneed, and he was a lieutenant. And he eventually was the boss as far as putting paperwork and contacting the security company, which was a private security company called Code 4 Security, and having them do kind of stuff where I was like the street supervisor, or whatever I would do would always be when they needed it, like special events or when they went places. It wasn't like an everyday bodyguard thing. I was just there for a video shoot when they would go to the MTV Awards or something like that. So I think we skipped a step. So you ultimately decide that you would moonlight for Suge in Death Row? Yes, sir. Okay, and despite your father thinking it wasn't the greatest idea, you decided that you wanted to be a part of it? Well, to be in charge of it. Someone else was in charge. And then so at this point, you're moonlighting like you're mentioning, bodyguarding for Suge every now and then, going to events at that point. He replies, yes, sir. And then at some point, do you suffer another physical injury that causes you to resign from the Compton PD? He says, yes, sir. Can you tell us briefly about what the injury was? He says, yes. He says, I had a traffic accident where I re-injured my right ankle. My ankle would just swell up by just standing on it for an hour or two. And so I knew at that point I wasn't capable, when the city also knew I wasn't capable of being a patrol officer for the city of Compton, anymore. Did you get a medical retirement from the Compton PD? Yes, sir. And then after you take medical retirement from Compton PD, what do? I really was more involved with Death Row Records security. Also opened up my own private security company. I'm sorry, about what month and year did you resign? He replies, he says, I resigned in, it didn't become official until 1996. However, it was off about a year, going through the whole process with my company. And that probably started in April of 1995, where I was more around. There's like a bureaucratic process that takes place from when you kind of make the decision to become official at the Compton Police Department. He says for the retirement, going through the workers' comp and all of that took about a year. But in April, they asked in April of 1995, you're working up setting Right Way, which is the name of that. He says productive service, Right Way Protective Services. And that was your security company? He says, yes, sir. And who was the primary client for Right Way? Death Row Records. And what would you do for Death Row Records? I had a security guard at the office space that they had. I had two at the recording studio that they had. And whenever their artists went out on promotional events or stuff like that, 1 or 2 security officers with them. Snoop Dogg, who was a popular or the biggest rap artist on the label, and Dr. Dre at the time. Now these two, Dre pretty much only used my security when he went publicly. However, Snoop had 2 guys with him at all times, because he had just went through a situation of his own with the case. Okay, so let's break that down a little bit. So you had security at an office space. Where was the office space? He says the office space at the time, well, we went through 3 during this period, but on Wilshire, Westwood, and the Murdoch Plaza is what it was called. And then we had an office on 9171, which was the Larry Flint building on Wilshire. And then later on, come after 96, a building on 8200 Wilshire. That was like the headquarters or the office space for people that were really professional people. I called them like staff, like the PR, the art department. The accounting firm was pretty much outside, but we had a later on-site bookkeeper, a receptionist, and Suge Knight's assistant. So people weren't necessarily talent on a yes sir. So you had an office space where you had, more like a 9-to-5 workers and the professionals, the staff and type thing. He says yes sir. And then you had a studio where you would record records, artists go to and create music for Death Row Records. He says, yes, sir. That was in Tarzana, California, a studio called Can-Am, which was called Radio Studios in Tarzana, California. And you said that there would be security there. You also mentioned a couple of the best known artists at the time. We're talking about 1995, right? He says, yes, sir. On Death Row Records, which was Snoop Dogg, he says Snoop Dogg, and the proper name Calvin Broadus, he says, yes, sir. And then you had Dr. Dre as well. Yes, sir, Andre Young. And they were also huge artists at the time. Is it fair to say that? He says, yes, sir. And the producer, he was also a co-owner. He says, yes, sir. And then Suge would have regular security with him. He says, yes, I will be with him a lot of the time. Probably at the point about 60% of his life, of his day. At that point, not 100%. But I wouldn't call myself security because he was a lot bigger than me, a lot stronger than me, but I will be with him. He also has somewhat of an entourage. Like homeboys that will be with him, maybe 3 or 4. So when he rode, he would generally be by himself in the car, but he will always be 85 to 90% of his life, maybe with two or other people with him. Now, you talked about homeboys. Assume you're talking about the people affiliated from the neighborhood. He says, yes, sir. Gentlemen that I spoke of had just got out of prison, and he may have given them jobs and stuff like that. Generally, those type of things. Did Suge associate himself with a particular neighborhood? He says, yes, sir. He says, what's that? Initially, the bigger one is called East Side Piru, but the other gentlemen in the neighborhood where he grew up were Lourdes Park Piru, and it broke off to smaller sides. The 4 or 5 streets in our area where we grew up, they called themselves Mob Pirus, M-O-B Pirus, P-I-R-U. What did Mob stand for? Did Mob stand for anything? He says, yes, sir. He says, what does it stand for? It stands for Members of Bloods. So is it fair to say Mob Piru was a blood-affiliated gang? Yes, sir. So I have to ask, since you're a former police, your father is head of the gang unit, and you're working security and hanging out with Mr. Suge Knight? He says, yes. And then Mr. Knight also was around Mob Piru members who were also affiliated with Mob Piru himself? Yes, sir. They asked, how does that work? Well, number one, because contrary to what people believe, especially back then, they had a little bit of respect for the police. Now, the kids hate police, but back then they kind of had a little respect. So it wasn't like we were best buddies or hanging out or anything, but I was also their childhood friend. Most of them I really knew before Suge Knight. We all went to school. The same schools, the same junior high schools. Now, we didn't have the same high schools because they went to Compton Unified School District, where I went to the Linwood Unified School District, but we all knew each other. I don't want to take a lot of credit for it, but I really got to say it because of the relationship or maybe the fear they had of my father, Reginald Sr. That they knew, if something happened or was disrespectful to Reginald Sr., something like that, the law more down on them or more sterner and hand them down maybe than being retired and not so high on the totem pole. But I really do believe he had respect for him because he was really that type of cop. And for a lot of this, his chief and all of them would attest to that. He was different. We learned later in life that in law enforcement, you got to be more community oriented, where in the early 90s, police was just a little bit different in my opinion. So part of it is that your dad and you grew up in the neighborhood. You were known to all of the folks in the neighborhood. Pretty much, yes. And then also to the fact that your dad was a lieutenant in a gang unit in Compton may have had an effect on how people treated you as well. Well, that's how I perceived it, yes, sir. So as part of being security for Suge Knight or Death Row, or running security for Death Row, did you become aware of the rivalry with Bad Boy Records? He says, yes, sir. He says, can you tell us about that rivalry? Well, you want me to go from the beginning of the war, where I believe it started, from where you know it started. From what I believe, and it's kind of a little story, so initially, Suge Knight and the owner of Bad Boy Records, which is Sean Puffy Combs, they had a decent relationship, a working relationship, even though he was from New York and Death Row was based in Los Angeles. But New York was kind of, where the big record labels were. Now, even though our record label was based in Beverly Hills, that was kind of over us, which was in Interscope Records. But their parent company was in New York as well. So we went to New York about, I can say from 95 when I came around, we probably was in New York at least 8 to 10 days out of a month that way. So they had a decent relationship, and Suge allowed them to use some samples from his album that he called The Chronic. Okay, I'm just gonna break that down a little bit. So you would go out to New York as security with Death Row Records and Suge quite a bit during this time in 1995. He says yes, and it was mainly business trips, and that so often it would mainly just be myself, Suge, usually a female companion, and maybe 2 of his homeboys. That would vary. And you talked about Suge giving samples to Puffy. Can you explain what that means? He says, yes, sample songs are generally songs that have been out already, that are pretty much successful, that artists like to put out in there to make us think of some reason like it's already been out and it's been successful. Another rapper or an artist will come up and use that song. So it is like the beats. There will be the same beat or the same music or melody on the song, and then you would come lend the beat or melody to another rapper and they will rap their own rhymes over it. Correct, sir. So what you're saying is Suge has such a good relationship with Mr. Combs that he would even lend out or let him have beats from music from a successful record that Mr. Combs could use for his artist. He says, yes, sir. Okay, and is it fair to say that typically somebody charges for something like that? He says charges a fair amount or deny. They don't even allow it to happen. So to you, that was indicative of the relationship between Suge and Puffy at the time? He says, yeah, so they had a great working relationship in my opinion at the time. And so did that change it all? He says, and so now Suge, there's this rapper by the name of Tupac Shakur. Yeah, Tupac. Well, I guess his name is Tupac Shakur, and he's in prison. Where's he in prison at? He's in New York. And he needed some financial help. Initially, that's all Suge. His wife at the time reached out to Suge and asked Suge for some assistance. Whose wife reached out to Suge? He says Tupac's. So Tupac's wife reached out to Suge Knight for financial assistance. He says, yeah, to say, hey, I'm having it rough here. Some of my people out here needed some help. And can you help me out? Because they had dealings in the past. And Suge was like, okay. So myself, David Kenner, we went to the prison. Now he says, who's David Kenner? He was like an attorney, the company's attorney, but he kind of had a lot of like business manager for Death Row. So they asked, he had a law degree, but he was acting as a business manager for Death Row. For Suge Knight, yeah. They kind of like had a close relationship. So you 3 go out to New York. What was the purpose of going out to New York? He initially had just went out there to check on him and talk to him. Talk to who? Mr. Shakur. And so during our conversation, it came up, hey, he's doing bad. His record label, who was also our distributor, Interscope Records, pretty much was done with him and felt like they gave him too much money and advanced him too much money, and he was in the hole. And he had the #1 album in the charts at the time. And it was like, hey, because of all his legal bills and stuff like that, we're not giving you any more money. And this is what Mr. Shakur was replying to you with Mr. Knight. Mr. Knight, I wasn't there, Mr. Knight. But what I know from hearing Mr. Kenner and Mr. Knight talk about when they came back to the car while I was in the car. He says, all right, so you became aware that Mr. Shakur was having financial problems and needed financial assistance while he was in prison in New York. He says, yes, sir. And did Mr. Knight did you observe Mr. Knight make a decision to do anything to assist Mr. Shakur? He said he came back to the car and he says, hey, I heard him get on the phone with Jimmy Iovine, who was the president or the CEO of Interscope Records, and they had conversations about how they can get him, give him some money, and I can assume fully responsibility for his contracts because he was still under the contract with Interscope Records. They eventually made a deal where they assigned his rights over to Suge Knight. And Suge Knight bought his mother a house while he was in prison and was giving him financial support. This is between May/June of 1995. So during this time, they're trying to figure it out. David Kenner assured Mr. Knight he could possibly get Mr. Shakur out on a pill bond. And eventually they worked out a deal where he got $1.5 million up and got him out on a pill bond. But then there was a music award show. So before we get to the music award show, So it's to your understanding, having been around Mr. Knight all of this time and dealing with him 60% of his life essentially during this time, that Mr. Knight obtained and put up $1.5 million as an appeal bond, released Mr. Shakur from custodial status of the New York prison. He says, yes, sir. And it was a combination of other entities that also put up the money. He says, yeah, okay. So during the time while Mr. Shakur is still in prison, did a public incident occur that demonstrated some type of rivalry between Mr. Knight and Mr. Combs of Bad Boy Records? He says, yes, sir. So what happened? Now, Mr. Shakur is still not out of prison, but things are beginning to work. You know how the justice systems work. Being assured that the wheels are turning. But there was a big urban hip hop music award called the Source Awards. It was a real big popular magazine at the time. They had an award show in New York, and Mr. Knight came out there and he had his artists performing. And he put up a cardboard picture of Mr. Shakur in one of those jail cells because he had all, well, we consider Death Row and all of his artists on death row, which means an inmate. And he had him in a cell and was announcing to everybody that Mr. Shakur is now on death row. People really weren't catching it. You know a lot more than most people do. So to explain it, is there a performance at this award show? Yes. So they were performing, that's why they had him on stage, because one of them came out of a cell and they performed their part of a song. And so the part of the set, there's a display that looks like a jail cell with a bunch of jail cells. He says, yes, sir. And then one of the jail cells displays Mr. Shakur being painted, or he said it was like a cardboard cut. Okay, so one of them in the jail cells, he says, yeah. So people probably saw it and didn't know, but I know. That's because I'm involved. He says, yeah. They asked, so what was that supposed to mean? He says, Mr. Knight gets on stage and he wins an award for the best executive of the year or best album of the year, something like that. He gets up there and publicly gives a statement disrespecting Puffy Combs. So are you aware whether this award show was televised or not? It was. So Mr. Knight is on stage at the awards that's being televised, and it's fair to say that he's taking verbal shots at Mr. Combs. He says yes. And that was the beginning of the rivalry. So that night, we go to an after party and Mr. Combs approached me, Mr. Knight, at the club. It was called The Tunnel in New York. He says, were you there? He says, I was there, standing right there. And they approached him. He's like, hey, what's going on? Why are you dissing me in front of everybody like that? Then it got heated, words or exchange of words, and they walked away. Everybody went, on their own separate ways. So this is August. The reason I know the date, because it was around my birthday, which is August the 5th. So it was either around the 3rd or the 6th of August when this took place. So then Mr. Knight goes to Atlanta. I wasn't with him, thank God, I missed the plane, but since you weren't there, let me ask this way. After Mr. Knight returned, did you see Mr. Knight after he returned from Atlanta? Oh, from Atlanta, or do you mean from New York? He says from Atlanta. So after this incident you're talking about, did you see him after that? He says, yes, sir. Did you come to learn that Mr. Knight's close associate was killed in Atlanta? He says, yes, sir. And who did Mr. Knight blame for his associate getting killed in Atlanta? He says a friend that was a close associate to Mr. Sean Combs, Puffy Combs. So Mr. Knight communicated with you that he believed Mr. Combs was responsible, if not directly, indirectly, for the murder of his good friend in Atlanta. He says, yes, sir. And Mr. Knight was in Atlanta when this occurred. He says, yes, sir. So it's fair to say, based on your observations, this only escalated the rivalry between Bad Boy Records and Death Row Records? He says, yes, sir. He asks a question. He says, as security, would you have to, go to events where Bad Boy may be also? Would you have to do security for Death Row where Bad Boy will also be there after that Atlanta incident? He says, okay, that would have been my responsibility. He says, yes. Now, generally, like I said, literally, it was an early morning flight. I missed the flight, so I was generally supposed to be there. People always tell me it was God looking out for me by keeping me there. But there's a little bit more I want to explain to the mindset why this rivalry started. They said, okay, what's your personal knowledge? He says, just I know from the industry, but I don't know. He says, let me ask you this. Did you ever have a conversation with Mr. Shakur, whether he had feelings towards Bad Boy Records? After his release from prison, not while in prison. He says, okay, when was Mr. Shakur released from prison? He says, October 12th, 1995. At that point, did Mr. Shakur become a recording artist for Death Row Records? He says, yes, sir. And he says, was he somebody now whose security you were responsible for? He says, I was responsible. I had security with him every day while he was out in public. And was it you specifically or somebody that you employed? He says, I hired. I had 4 to 5 different security guards on him daily, different ones daily from time actually till his death, to be honest. Now this escalating situation with Bad Boy Records, did you become aware whether Bad Boy Records had used Compton gangs for security when they were in LA or the Southern California region? He says, yes, sir. And he says, based on your observation, what gangs did Bad Boy employ as the security while in Southern California? He says, gentlemen from the Compton Southside Crips. Familiar with the Southside Crips growing up in Compton? From growing up other than playing baseball with them. Knowing they were from that area, but not until I became a police officer or started working in the jail that I learned the difference, to be honest. So he says you became more familiar with Southside after you were adult and working in jails while working patrol. He says that would be correct. He says, so how did you become aware that Bad Boy Records were using Southside Crips as the security in Southern California? He says streets talking, but mainly saw them at a few events with them in large numbers. So you go back to Mr. Shakur when he was released. When he talks about the anger he had towards Puffy or Sean Combs and his primary recording artist, Christopher Wallace, he says, yes, sir. And do you remember what Christopher Wallace's rap name was? He had a few, but Biggie Smalls, Notorious Big, Big Papa. So without getting into details, is it fair to say that Mr. Shakur had really strong feelings about Mr. Combs and Mr. Wallace? He says, yes, sir. And that ever reflected on any of his music? He says music and even portrayed in music videos that he did during that time period. He says, are you familiar with the song called Hit 'Em Up? He says, yes, sir. And it is fairly to say that that song and that music video, Mr. Shakur goes out of his way to insult Mr. Combs and Mr. Wallace in the most graphic and explicit possible. He said it's possible. He says it's still one of the top 3 diss records ever talked about in the hip hop community as far as a record label in disrespect to another label as their family members. I mean, it's fair to say that Mr. Shakur was talking about having sex with Mr. Wallace's wife. He says, yes, sir. And talking about killing members of the Bad Boy label, yes, sir. He says, as the crew. The record label, the staff, significantly anybody who was a part of the crew he mentioned, he says, yes, sir. And would that include as part of the crew, meaning anybody associated with Bad Boy Records? He says, yes, sir. And now it's part of the hip hop culture and you're aware. You mentioned that it was still talked about as one of the best diss records. Is dissing or disrespecting other artists part of the hip hop culture if you're aware? He replies, he says, it doesn't happen as often as you would think, but it does happen, yes, sir. And we had Idi Amin, Malcolm Greenidge testify in the case. Well, were you aware of Malcolm Greenidge being associated with Tupac Shakur? He says, yes, sir. He says, a part of that particular song, Hit 'Em Up? He says, yes, sir. Also, to your knowledge, was he a close associate with Mr. Shakur? He says, I believe so, yes, sir. Yeah, I know, yes, sir. Now I want to get to another award show. The Soul Train Awards in 1996. You at the Soul Train Awards? He says, yes, sir. Where was the Soul Train Awards? It was at the Shrine Auditorium in Los Angeles, California. Shrine Auditorium. And to your knowledge, was Bad Boy the record label? Were they also expected to be at the Soul Train Awards? He says, yes, sir. Can you tell us what you experienced leading up to the Soul Train Awards? He says, well, we had there was some back and forth regarding, who was going to open up the award show. Well, Mr. Cornelius elected to go with Biggie Smalls to open the show. So Mr. Knight pulled Mr. Shakur from performing at that particular show. However, he convinced Mr. Knight to have Mr. Shakur come and he would be very happy. That was his exact words that I heard him tell him. So was there a decision to actually attend the show? He says, yes, sir. As this was in March of 1996, he says, yes, sir. And so how many people arrive or go to the Soul Train Awards from Death Row? On that particular night, we had about 50 to 60 associates. And by 50 to 60 associates, I assume some of them people were working for you in the Right Way Protective Services, right? He says, yeah, actually that night, we only had about 2 or 3 guys there. So who made up the 50 to 60? A few artists, maybe 8 to 10 of them, and the others were gang members from the Compton area, not just Mob Piru, but from Piru areas in the city of Compton. So all blood sets. Pirus is what we call them in Compton. Okay, Piru sets. He says, yes, sir, it's the same as Bloods. Is it communicated that you are going to enter the award show, whether from the front or the back, or how does that work? So our intention initially was all to go through the back gate, a private entryway, the back where they have motorhomes and where artists come out. They have little dressing rooms and stuff like that, and very limited parking space. But I got a heads up and played a little double agent that day, and that they were planning on being disruptive at the award show. And when you say they, do you mean the members of the Pirus who were showing up or planning to show up at the Soul Train Awards? Yeah, with us, with Death Row Records, yes, sir. And so I knew the head of security at the Shrine, and I tipped them off what was about to happen and only allowed a limited amount of people, in which they did. So who was allowed through the artist's interest or in the backstage? It was Mr. Knight, Mr. Shakur, and he had about 3 or 4 members of the Outlaws, which would be Mr. Edie, Malcolm Green, I believe, Malcolm Greenidge, and 2 other members. They were singing artists named Danny Boy. They were in a Hummer with Mr. Knight. Myself and Frank Alexander, which was Mr. Shakur's primary security, was trailing behind him, and I was riding in the passenger seat of Mr. Alexander's vehicle. I'm going to fast forward in this event a little bit. At some point, there was a confrontation between Death Row Records and Bad Boy Records, or backstage of a show. He says, yes, sir. So what happened was, like I said, they elected to have Biggie Smalls or Mr. Wallace perform. And while they were leaving, they were planning on leaving probably because they knew that Death Row was coming. I don't know, but they were planning on leaving. As we're going into the auditorium or exiting our vehicles, we go into the auditorium, they're coming out. So I guess it was just a bad timing, and there was an argument that followed by a little of gunplay or a pointing. So who was the argument between? He says Mr. Shakur was the most vocal, Mr. Wallace, and then his entourage. As you speak about Mr. Wallace's entourage there, were there any members you had mentioned earlier, Southside Crips doing security for Bad Boy? Were there any members of the Southside Crips with Mr. Wallace during this incident? He says, yes, there was approximately 10 to 15 gentlemen that were exiting. I noticed about 8 to 9 that were known from the city of Compton, from my law enforcement days. And I did notice one particular individual. And what particular individual did you notice? Mr. Davis, Mr. Keefe Davis, or Dwayne Davis? Mr. Davis go by a nickname that you're aware of? He says, yes, sir. And he says, what's that nickname? Keefe D. And is it fair to say that you knew Mr. Davis to be a member of the Southside Compton Crips during this period? He says, yes, sir. He says, I mainly knew him as a gang member, but mainly knew because he was a major drug player in our city. Okay, and so he was with somebody that was common knowledge within your city that Mr. Davis wasn't necessarily a shooter as much as somebody who dealt narcotics. He says, correct. Now I'm going to show you grand jury exhibit number 2. It's on the monitor. Do you recognize the person depicted in grand jury exhibit number 2? He says, yes, sir. He says, who is that? That's Keefe Davis. I knew him by his moniker, but I believe his correct name is Dwayne Keefe Davis. You knew him as Keefe D? He says, Keefe D, yes. You mentioned that it was a gunplay in this incident. It's fair to say that you did not see Mr. Davis with a firearm during that event. No, I didn't see him with a firearm. And nobody actually shot a firearm during this event. He says, no, just a gentleman brandished a weapon. And the gentleman associated with Bad Boy label, or was this with the Death Row label? Definitely Bad Boy record label. He was standing next to in the area with Mr. Davis in the area of Mr. Wallace. Okay, can you tell us about what happened? What exactly happened? So as we, like I said, getting out the vehicles, exiting the vehicles to go where they were coming out, immediately she noticed them and started to yell towards them. At that time, I'm next to Shakur. A gentleman brought out his gun from his waist, but he never raised the gun, but I did. So one of the people associated with Bad Boy Records brandished a firearm but did not point it at anybody. He says, correct. And you did what you do as a result of being security, right? He says, yes, sir. He says, what did you do as a result of seeing this? He says, I jumped out of my car and I pretty much was on top of it, in my words. I pointed my gun towards the gentleman with the gun and begged him not to point that gun or raise his gun. Did the situation resolve without any shots being fired? He says, yes, sir. They took off and ran toward the streets of the parking lot. I'll strike that. All right, I'm going to fast forward to Vegas. Okay, was it common for Death Row Records to come out of Vegas for Mike Tyson's fights? Yes, sir. Come out typically with Death Row Records for these fights? Says, yes, sir. He says, how many fights would you say you went out to prior to this incident? He said 3. Now we're here, all leading up to this time. We're talking about September 7th, 1996. Okay, leading up to this time, we have the Soul Train Awards, March of 1996, and now we have the Tyson fight, September of 1996. He says, yes, sir. And he says, is it fair to say the hostilities between Bad Boy Records are still going on or maybe even increasing? It was major because of that song, Hit 'Em Up, had been released earlier, but not on the initial album. It was released in February, and it kind of hit the streets around April or May, and it was making a lot of noise. And then it's fair to say that during that time, as far as you know, that the Southside Crips were doing work for Bad Boy Records. He says, yes, sir. He says, is it fair to say during that time, Death Row is still affiliating themselves with Mob Piru? Yes, sir. Now, initially, when you go out to Vegas, what were you responsible for the Tyson/Sheldon fight, September of 1996? He says, you know me, I like patting myself on the back and saying everything other than getting the rooms and getting everything ready. But I was pretty much Suge's point-to guy or go-to guy, you know, in the streets. Like I said, not in the office, but in his office, his assistants would pretty much communicate everything to me because it was hard to get a hold of Mr. Knight. But my main responsibility that night and my biggest concern on my plate was getting to the club. Club 662 ready for Shakur, Mr. Knight, and the Entourage and everybody to come in and get in there successfully. And we had an issue trying to get our permits and licensing. All of that, we were trying to get to the point where we had a good showing for those people involved. So it's fair to say, largely you were responsible for logistics and security? He says, yes, sir. So now for the people who were coming out to the Las Vegas fight, it would be Suge. Is it fair to say? He says, of course. Mr. Shakur? Yes, sir. We had talked a little bit about the rap group Outlaws. Was it your expectation that they were coming out that weekend? He says, a couple of them, because a couple of them was too young, and I think only 2 of them came that was in the group. He says, okay, then you know Suge, some of his, they call homeboys, come out as well. He says, yes. Amongst those homeboys, are you familiar with the moniker Neckbone? He says, yes, sir. He says, who is that? He says, Roger Williams. And did you know him to be a Mob Piru member? He says, yes, sir. And then Buntry, are you familiar with somebody that went by Buntry? He says, yes, sir. He says, who is that? He says, Alton McDonald. And was he a Mob Piru member? He says, yes, sir. And was he out there? Yeah, out there in 96. He says, yes, sir. And in September of 96, and did you know somebody by the name of Mob James? He says, yes, sir. And what was his true name? James McDonald. And was he also out there for the weekend of 96? He says, yes, sir. And was he also affiliated with the Mob Piru? He says, yes, sir. He says, do you know somebody by the name of Trayvon Lane? He says, yes, sir. He says, what's his nickname if you know? Trey or Youngster? We call him Youngster. Probably in the streets, they just refer to him as Trey. He's somebody that also came out there for the fight. He says, yes, sir. Was he also affiliated with the Mob Piru? Yes, sir. Now, I want to talk to you a little bit about Mr. Lane. We've heard of the incident that allegedly occurred at the Lakewood Mall prior to the fight of September of 96. Is that right? Yes, sir. He says, were you there? He says, where, the fight at the mall? He says, no, sorry. But had you become aware of this idea of Mr. Lane's chain being taken from? He said, attempted to be taken from him. He says, okay, you tell us a little bit about, were you familiar with those Death Row chains? He says, yes, sir. The Death Row chains were gifted to all of us as Christmas gifts that were considered real close to Mr. Knight. We got them in December of 1995, Christmas. And there were different variations of them. That one is mine. Okay, for the record, I've got to clean up the record. I put it on the monitor, showing Mr. Wright's exhibit number 41. Can you tell us what you're looking at in grand jury exhibit number 41? He says, a Death Row chain, one variant to the Death Row chain that were gifted by Mr. Knight as Christmas gifts to certain artists and certain people that he would consider his staff. As you said, I think you had said specifically in grand jury exhibit number 41, is this your chain? Is that right, your medallion? I could have sworn I gave that picture because I recognized the background. I know because they had different variants of diamonds. I think Mr. Ladd must have provided that to you all. If not, then somehow you got it. Fair to say you recognize this as being a Death Row medallion. He says, yes, sir. Did Mr. Knight give these chains to just anybody, or did you have to be somebody close and meaningful to Death Row Records or to him? He says, yes. Like there were different variants. I would like to explain, because some on the records part, the Death Row doesn't have diamonds. Some of them are all diamond, even the bezel, like his main artist, Mr. Shakur and Snoop Dogg. Mr. Knight had a pretty big one. His was bigger and more diamond out as well. The ones that Mr. Lane and them had, it's just diamonds. It was just diamonds. It wasn't on the Death Row in the records. It was just the man. It was supposed to be an electric chair, a guy sitting on an electric chair because we're on Death Row. And that's how Mr. Lane and his guys, I will call homeboys, their chains were done. It was only about 6 to 8 of them that had it. Maybe 4 artists, maybe 4 to 5 artists, maybe a little bit more. 6 artists that had them. Is it fair to say that Death Row and Mr. Knight, Mr. Shakur, even took a lot of pride in having these Death Row chains? Yes, sir. Is it also fair to say that if somebody was trying to take a chain, it would be an ultimate sign of disrespect? Yeah, very much so. Even would catch a lot of flack for not coming back with our chain. So what would happen if someone had their chain taken away from them? To us or to the person who did it? Well, bro, first to you, what would happen to you? If you came back and you didn't have your death row chain, would you lose status, or what would you face within the group? He says hazing. He says hazing, okay. A lot of hazing I think will happen to the ones that eventually later, because he started giving out more and they would lose them and get into fights behind them. They got hazed. Nothing major, but just major hazing. And how would members of death row feel about someone trying to steal their chain, especially somebody who was a homeboy? Yeah, we had heard that there was a bounty on him, so we were all on alert. I didn't wear mine out. If I went in the Entourage or something like that, I just didn't need the drama. And so to lose one back at that time, if it would have, you would have had to probably retaliate in some type of way. Not the artist or myself, but definitely the homeboys. Is that safe to say that that's particularly true if somebody's trying to take a chain from a homeboy? Yeah, that would definitely have to prove their status. So I guess you're right. They might have been disowned or something if there wasn't any retaliation or something behind losing their chain. Now, you obviously heard a lot of talk. It's common knowledge that there was an incident at the Lakewood Mall prior to the Tyson fight that involved Trayvon Lane. Is that right? He says, yes, sir. Was Suge Knight aware of the incident that somebody attempted to take Trayvon's chain from him? He says, yeah. I don't know if it was June or May when it happened. It was only like a couple of months prior to the incident at the MGM that his chain was, we always got the word attempted. Don't know if Mr. Knight gave him one, if there's evidence that it was taken. Mr. Knight may have wanted to save face. I know he still claimed to always still have his chain. Even to this day, I see him with the chain. All right, but in terms of you, Mr. Knight and Mr. Shakur were aware that somebody at least attempted to take Trayvon's chain during that Lakewood Mall incident. It was very known around the label, yes, sir. Is it fair to say this? Were they aware that you were aware that it was that people associated with the Southside Crips, that they was the ones allegedly responsible for trying to take away or actually take away that death row chain? He says, yes, sir. And did you have some type of, amongst the label, was there a person in particular that all felt that they might be responsible for taking the chain off Trayvon Lane? I don't know if I learned that later. Okay, so if you don't know, we'll move on. He says, all right. So you got Trayvon, who is involved in the incident at the Lakewood Mall. You got Shakur. You got several members of the Mob Pop Rule. You got Mr. Knight planning on coming to Vegas. Is that right? That's correct, sir. And did you come with them or did you come before? He says, I came the day before Friday. There was a class. Let me guide this to make it a little bit clearer. So you got there before them. You said part of the things you were concerned about was logistics, particularly associated with the club. Is that right? He says, yes, sir. And what club were you talking about? He says, Club 662. He was trying to own the club. I don't know if it was at some point the owner of the club. What was the project out there? Do you come out to meet him with an attorney to talk about running the club and conforming to the Nevada regulations as it relates to running the club? He says, yes, sir. And what was the name of the attorney? He says, George Callis. And when you a part of coming out here early, did you have your security folks out here early as well? He says, yes, sir. Was that because you learned you needed a work card and able to work the club? He says, yes, sir. He says, did you have to take a class associated with getting the work card? He says, yes, sir. He says, did you and your people take the class? He says, my people did, I didn't go. All right, and were you aware, were there supposed to be a big event at Club 662 Saturday night, the night of the Tyson Bruce Seldon fight? He says, yes, sir. He says it was a club where we did live performances or shows, but mainly it was a bar and a dance club. He says, okay, where was it located? 1700. I don't know if it was 1701 or 1700 from Lingo. And how far was it away from the strip? He says, I guess 17 blocks. He says, you don't remember? He says, yeah, 1700. So then was part of your concern about running the club the concern that you wanted it to be in much conformity with the statutes and regulations that it could keep up this club running? He says, yes, sir. He says, was the club new at the time or was it old? He says, well, it's been a club prior, I guess. There were some previous owners. Like I said, I was learning them. But the main reason why we had got Mr. Kellis assumed that we were going to get scrutinized that night heavily and that we should be on point, and this is how we would do things. And real shortly, Mr. Knight or whoever had, because I don't know to this part today, was going to put the name of the club into, it should be getting finalized if everything went well, because it was not a club that Mr. Knight at the time opened up every night or every weekend or so. It only opened under his management. So I guess it would be correct. 8 times, which would have been Friday, Saturday on those 4 previous fight nights that had been mentioned, and we also shot 1 music video that wasn't open to the public for a St. Ives beer and liquor commercial. We shot a video there. It was only 1 time that club ever opened during Mrs. Knight's reign. Was it your understanding? The hope was for this night that it would go successful and you guys would become the proper certification and be allowed to club more and do more business at Club 662. To put in your correct words, but yes, sir. So now you were given any instructions as to whether or not you all should be or allowed to have firearms in the club or in the city while you were trying to get this business deal down in the meeting. So either myself or Mr. Kellis in the meeting I had with all my security, who were mainly off-duty or retired police officers, and I informed him that I forgot who it was, but I know I echoed it if I wasn't the one who said it, banned them from having their firearms on them or inside the nightclub. If they had a problem with it, then don't come to work. All right, now I'm trying to focus your attention to the day of the Tyson Seldon fight. So we were on Friday. Now we're moving on to Saturday, the day of the fight. Okay, do you recall where you guys were staying? At the Luxor Hotel, And where was everybody else associated with Death Row going to stay? The staff, the working staff, and the artists. But Mr. Knight and about 3 of his friends, Mr. Knight had just purchased a home out here about 4 months prior, and you know he had got a lot of renovation done to it. As a matter of fact, we were having the next day a big family reunion, meaning Sunday, where we're planning to have a lot of his family members out, go to the club, of course. We were going to have a big family reunion. He was giving a big party because he wanted to show off his house. Maybe about 4 of those people were going to be at that house. But so the artists like Shakur, the Outlaws, other artists that were coming out, they were staying at the Luxor. Even myself, I had a room at the Luxor. You were at the Luxor as well? Yes. And so other staff and security, they were staying at the Luxor as well? Yes, sir. Okay, what time do you recall the fight was supposed to start? Generally 7:30 to 8 o'clock. Is this when you want to be over there? And when did Mr. Shakur and Mr. Knight arrive, if you know? Well, at the Luxor. Are you driving from LA? Yeah. About 3-ish, 4 p.m. that day, yes, sir. And did you see them when they arrived? I seen Mr. Shakur for sure. I think Mr. Knight just came by the hotel. I don't remember him getting out or anything because it was like he was trying to get to the house. It was a little, rush. We was always running late, always behind time. But he didn't get out and come in the hotel and walk around and mingle. Would you describe this night as being organized or unorganized? My side, I was the logistic guy, so I guess it would be my fault. It would have kind of been an unorganized crew. Was it your intention to be at the fight that night? Potentially, yes, sir. What happened? Were you able to go to the fight? I didn't go because I had issues at the club, of course. All right, I didn't go because of issues at the club, of course. And us being unorganized, we're even to the fact that Mr. Shakur called me looking for Mr. Knight, as everyone always did. And he pretty much informed me that he's tired of going to the fight late, because Mike Tyson's fights usually be over then in the first round. And even with Mr. Shakur, his music, he had rapped a song for him to enter the ring in, and he wanted to be there. And he and his security caught a cab over to the fight. Mr. Shakur took a cab to the MGM Grand for the fight. Yes, sir, from the Luxor. You mentioned his security. Do you recall his security then? Yes, sir. Who was that? Mr. Frank. His name was Frank Alexander. All right. So that's the same person you talked about earlier. At the Soul Train? Yes, sir. Yes. Okay. So when Mr. Shakur and Mr. Alexander are off to the MGM Grand, do you ever make it to the MGM Grand at all? I went by there, saw that parking, and we had little Nextel walkie-talkies. I was getting a lot of feedback and issues with my security, and I just elected to go to the club to make sure everything was in order at the club. Is it fair to say your focus was executing the club to go well? Yes. And were you aware or was not aware that it was supposed to be a performance at that club that night? Yes, sir. Who was supposed to perform that night? Well, I know an artist we had just signed from Bad Boy Records. Bad Boy, he had just started up Death Row East. His name was Craig Mack. He was going to perform there. Guy who worked out because he had done some community service that was needed. We were going to do some community service, and they were donating some of the proceeds to this boxer foundation from the Las Vegas Police Department. And so Mr. Shakur was going to be the one to perform. Okay, all right. And so the night you spent most of your evening at Club 662 while Mr. Shakur, Mr. Knight, and some of the entourage were at the MGM. Yes, sir. So you don't see the fight. You don't go in at all. Yes, sir. Correct. So while you're working the logistics at Club 662, how is everything going as the evening progresses? Kind of proud finally. finally working the way it was supposed to work the club, as far as the crowd control outside, because we had contracted Las Vegas Police Department. I don't know if it was on duty or off duty, officers, but they were in uniform to control the parking lot and crowd control from the door on. And my security had it from inside the door on, and it was very organized. Metro Police did a good job that night. At some point, did you see some people come to you and say, hey, something actually going wrong that night? Yeah, can you tell me about that? Don't know the approximate time, I guess around 11 somewhere. Two gentlemen that we talked about earlier, Roger Williams, aka Neckbone, Alton McDonald, aka Buntry, like country, but with the B, came inside the club and was like, Reggie, Suge and Pac just got shot down the street. I initially was thinking they were tripping because I wasn't with Suge, and Suge told y'all to come up here and tell me that. And they were like, no, we're serious. By this time, Mr. Kellesis was near me. George Kellesis, the attorney, he kind of confirmed to me, he was like, yeah. So, and I'm also seeing a few of the Las Vegas Police Department that was working the door or working the parking lot. They're visiting, or maybe visiting the guys that were working, I don't know, but they're leaving with lights and sirens going towards the area. So I kind of knew about that time. So it was true. Prior to hearing from Buntry and Neckbone that Suge and Tupac had been shot, had you heard anything about a fight at the MGM or Southside? An issue with the Southside Crips at all? He says nothing. That's one problem I had with my security, Mr. Alexander. He didn't notify me on what transpired, but he said his walkie-talkie, because we had Nextels back then where you could operate with like two-way radios. They had a dual. It would be a phone or it could be a walkie-talkie, but he didn't notify me. But this was his first day back from being off from like a month, and he said his walkie-talkie, he hadn't got his walkie-talkie or it was dead, something like that. But no one told me what happened, which to be honest, a fight, it was kind of common. Yeah, I was going to follow up a question, was working doing security for Death Row Records by this time for about a year and a half, having Moonlight for, years before were fights common. He said kind of common. Was it something that you were overly concerned about if you heard that it was a fight? If it would have been explained to me in the magnitude, yes, it was. By just that, hey, they got in a fight with some guys at the MGM, no. So you're talking about the magnitude of who it was. Did you later come to learn that the person the fight was with was Orlando Anderson? Yes, sir. And at that time, were you aware that Mr. Anderson was a member of the Southside Crips? Yes, sir. And would it give you a concern? Somebody who knew gangs from growing up in Compton, gangs from Patrol, gangs that were just working with Death Row, would it have given you some concern that there was some altercation with a significant member of the Southside Crips? Yes, sir. Now, when Buntry and Neckbone come out, do you ever see their car? Yes, sir. Do you notice anything different about their car when you last saw it? Yes, sir. He says, what do you notice? There was a bullet in the left fender of his black Toyota Spatra. And prior to that incident or prior to seeing that car that night, have you ever noticed a bullet hole? He said, no, sir. And was it to your common knowledge that it was common practice for guys from the neighborhood gang members to immediately fix bullet holes in their vehicles? You don't drive with a car that has bullet holes in it, mainly not so much for embarrassment of the gunshot, but because the police could potentially harass you a little more, because generally they believe, and I believe, if a police officer, when I see someone just recently shot at and they carry a gun to protect themselves, one, either they have issues with somebody, or two, maybe in fear, I'd rather be judged than carried. So we talked at the beginning that your father, Reggie Wright Sr., was a lieutenant in the gang unit right around this time. Is that fair to say? He says yes. So was he in Vegas or was he in Compton during this time, during that night of the shooting? No, he was in Compton. Well, I guess he was at home. You don't know, but to your knowledge, he wasn't in Vegas. No, he wasn't in Vegas. Where did you go after the shooting? Did you ultimately make your way down to UMC? Yes, sir. Did you drive there or did someone else drive you there? No, the attorney, George Kellesis, because I didn't know my way around Vegas, but he drove me to the hospital. And during this time, do you see Mr. Knight? He says, yes. About 2 hours probably after the shooting, I seen him in the emergency room at the hospital. Is it fair to say that he survived the shooting? Yes. To your recollection, did he stay there for a few days or was he released that night? No, he left. I left prior to him getting released, but I was back at his house around 7 a.m. that morning and he was there. And Mr. Shakur, was he still in the hospital? Yes, sir. Were there a lot of friends, associates, and people who were actually at the incident gathering at the hospital while Mr. Shakur was being treated? Yes, definitely later. Not initially upon my arrival, but during that night, yes, sir. And were they upset? Very. Were they emotional? Very. Would it be fair to say or unfair to say that they were under the stress of what they had experienced of Mr. Shakur getting shot at? I guess they would be, that's fair. Did you talk to any of these people about what happened? Without getting to the details of what they said that you talked to them. Tension was up. The artists, the people, not the guys, meaning the homeboys. Maybe talk to them a little later. It was mainly like the people from the club that heard about it and started filtering themselves over, which would have been people that didn't know too much, yeah. Ultimately, did you talk to some of the homeboys and the artists about what had gone on? Yes, he says, as a result of talking to the homeboys and the artists, did you call your father? He says, yes. Why did you call your father? Well, initially, I just called him to tell him, hey, Tupac and Suge were just shot. Now, I know probably later, I'm sure I was calling, talking to him all that night, but I remember relaying something to him. And later that night, meaning around 3, 4, 5 o'clock, somewhere around that evening, did you feel the need to reply information to your father? Yes, because I learned regarding the incident that happened at the MGM that it had something to do with the gentleman from the Southside Crips, and I knew the gentlemen from that neighborhood that were associated with us, the Mob Power Rules in the Lotus Park, were very upset about it. Were you concerned that there would be a subsequent violence in Compton as a result of this happening in Vegas? Yes, sir. And contacting your father, who was a lieutenant of the gang unit, seemed like information he should know. Yes, sir. And in the course of the 27 years since the shooting September 6, 1996, there have been all sort of theories on who was responsible for shooting Tupac. You're aware of that, right? Yes, sir. I have to ask you, are you responsible in any way for shooting and killing Mr. Shakur? No, sir. Finally, is this true that in 2017, you were convicted of a felony sales of marijuana? Yes, sir. And you were convicted of another felony as well, money laundering associated with the sales of marijuana. And those felonies are in federal court. Is that fair? He says yes. That's all we got.